Tēnā koutou, no Colorado, America ho. He ototahi toku ingoa, kainga inaiane, ko Frances toku ingoa. He kamahia ho ki te punaheri taia ki Waitaha, ki te mahi aho, ki te tima reirenga rauropi. I'm originally from Colorado in the States, as you probably guessed from my accent. I live in Christchurch now, and I've been in Aotearoa since 1992. And I work for Environment Canterbury currently in the regional biodiversity team. In that role, I manage a couple of braided river work streams, one of which we'll talk about today. And I'm co-presenting with Sarah and Jazz from Boffa-Miskell. Boffa-Miskell manages the biosecurity operations for Toitū Te Whenua LINZ. And I want to acknowledge Sarah for the work she did in putting this presentation together for us. So we'll quickly introduce the background to this and then how the approach to this work has changed over time. Then we'll give an overview of the control and the strategies that have guided this. We'll then talk a little bit about a benefit area concept we've developed and that we're exploring, a few key learnings and what the future is looking like a bit. So as most of you in this room will know, weed encroachment can be quite an issue in braided rivers, impacting up to 75% in some rivers. This impacts the river morphology, the channels, resulting in a loss of habitat and biodiversity. Lower catchments can be particularly impacted because of their downstream of seed sources. A lot of the seeds aren't carried by water. Also, they're in highly modified landscape, which can lead to increased variety of weeds. The upper catchments, however, are usually more intact in terms of natural character and biodiversity values. Therefore, the funding goes further, so this is often where we invest our money when we have a biodiversity focus. There are several landscape scale weed management control programs occurring across the region. I'm going to focus on two today, probably two of the ones that are more developed. One acknowledges sits alongside a lot of other biosecurity work in those two catchments, including trapping, blackback gull control, and control of some other pest species. ECAN got involved in this work through the Canterbury Water Management Strategy. There was new funding online to help meet some of the braided river goals and targets. So once that had been approved for work up in those two catchments because of the values, we then developed an implementation strategy. That involved getting together with a large group of stakeholders, 40 to 50, and through that we identified what were the biodiversity values, what were the threats to those values, what were other groups or people already doing or agencies, and then where were the gaps. Through that, weed control was identified as a high priority, and therefore we joined the efforts of some other agencies and land care groups that were doing some weed control. Over time, the approach has evolved. Initially, we pooled our funding with the Department of Conservation, and now it's also pooled with Toitū Te Whenua LINZ, who is leading this work via Boffa-Miskell. Now I'll hand over to Sarah.
Tēnā koutou katoa, he tangata tiriti aho, no otatahi aho ko Sarah Thwaites toku ingoa. Tēnā koutou katoa. Morena, everyone. I am Sarah Thwaites. I'm a biosecurity project coordinator at Boffa-Miskell. I'm actually here today presenting on behalf of Pete Caldwell, who is the program manager for the Rakatata and Rakaia River weed control programs, which we deliver on behalf of Toitū Te Whenua and Information New Zealand. So to pick up where Frances left off, the pooled funding approach allows us to have a single program manager to deliver operations. This creates several efficiencies, and one I wanted to just quickly touch on is efficiencies for our contractors that are out delivering the work on the ground. So instead of them potentially returning several times to these sort of quite remote places under different contracts with different requirements, they just have a single agreement to work under, which also means they just have a single project manager to deal with, one place to submit their data and invoices. This approach also allows contractors to work across land tenure, so they're not held up by boundary lines. They control weeds that maybe were once just over the fence and they couldn't, but now they can. So these landscape scale programs require a high trust between the agencies, and we undertake and rely on ongoing collaboration with a wide range of stakeholders. So each year before we commence operations, we have a pre-season stakeholder meeting, and we discuss priorities and make sure we're understanding what's most important. And then for rivers like the Rakatara, we have a monthly online meeting where we can share progress with the work that's being done. We also maintain relationships with the landcare groups. So the Upper Rangitata Gorge Landcare Group, they also pull their money together and undertake weed control adjacent to our program. So we meet with them quite regularly to ensure there's a cohesive plan for the catchment. And we also regularly attend the landcare group meetings in person for both the Rakatara and Rakaia rivers. It's just a good chance to catch up and see what else is going on in those rivers. So data's a real theme today, and something I'm quite passionate about. So one of the other benefits to just having one program manager is the ability to control the types of data we receive. Data is critical in helping us create a story of what's been actually happening on the ground in these catchments by capturing the surveillance and control that's been undertaken. So that screenshot there, the black lines are the ground control work, the white lines are the aerial surveillance, and the yellow points are the aerial spot spray control. So the type and quality of data that is captured by our contractors is important. It enables standardization and integrity. It also lets us present in a variety of ways. So this screenshot comes from an online viewer that is publicly accessible. And we can also pull this data onto apps that people can take into the field. And we can do static PDF maps as well. And yeah, so this brings us a step closer to Simon Upton's PCE report, which most of you probably have read, which aims for a single authoritative database of exotic weed species. So our general approach to weed control is guided by weed strategies, which Jazz will talk to in a minute. But as Frances mentioned earlier, we focus on controlling weeds in the upper catchments. We target remote and isolated plants, which you can see the pretty two broom plants up the Matthias with not a lot of other weeds around. So that we aim to protect, I guess, the more pristine areas. We've also moved from focusing just on RPMP species like broom and gorse to a wider biodiversity focus. As the RPMP is written for a 10-year period, it doesn't always capture weeds that are quickly becoming a threat. I'll hand over now to Jazz Morris, our experienced terrestrial ecologist.
Kia ora everybody, called Jazz Morris toka ingoa. I'm a terrestrial ecologist at Boffin and in the last couple of years I've had the privilege of delivering some of these catchment weed strategies for the riverbeds in the upper Waimakariri and the upper Rakaia River. This kind of program or approach of deciding what you control and where kicked off in 2013 with the first Rakaia strategy by Mike Harding. The idea of these strategies is they encompass survey across all land tenures and generally the entire upper catchments, looking beyond RPMP species, as Sarah mentioned, and it really enables a catchment-wide stock take of where the weeds are. You can control remote weeds in the field because often you're going up into the farthest reaches to look for them. And by taking that catchment-wide view, it allows you to develop a set of priorities for that area that can be scalable to your changing level of funding or to enable new funding applications if you can't achieve all of the priorities with your existing baseline. The survey and delivery of these strategies in recent years has broadened the focus to not just riverbed weeds. By leveraging the survey effort that you're undertaking, you can look at things like homesteads, settlements, transport corridors, and understand future issues. Now, often you're looking at species that are not necessarily going to be the weeds of the gravel BRaid plain, but you can be finding the weeds that will be there in the shrublands or the native forests. And to give an example, just looking at this hot mess of weeds in Lake Coleridge Village, one of the species in that photo, you can see spindle tree. In our recent strategy, we've identified this as likely to be spreading throughout the Rakaia catchment because of that massive seed source there at Lake Coleridge Village, and that will be another thing in the mix of braided river shrubland species of concern. Adding to the focus on this is climate change and the influence that will have on weeds. Now, obviously, with climate change, you'll have bigger floods that will more often kind of reset the river BRaid plain. While that's good in a kind of short-term cosmetic sense, it opens up the gravels. The benefits of that could well be outweighed by longer term trends. One of the key processes, of course, in braided rivers is that dynamic re-establishment of a mosaic of indigenous vegetation that needs to come from somewhere if you've just had a flood rip out the fairway. And so the ecological integrity of the vegetation and habitats on those adjacent shrublands, wetlands, forests, and so on is really critical in terms of dictating what comes back, whether it's exotic weeds or whether it's the natives. Now, moving on to Frances.
Yeah. So this is the benefit area concept that I mentioned earlier. And what we're looking at here is trying to capture the full benefit that can be accrued by investing in weed control, especially early weed control. So the map shows the outline for the Rakitata catchment. In green is what we've classified as the benefit area. So areas not invaded by weeds, but could be. And the pink is where there's been searching and then control of weeds when they're found. The white is excluded because it's not considered a benefit area, but because of, for example, it might be farmland, so it would be controlled anyway. The two circles there, the pink is that search and control area. The little red dots are where the actual weed control is occurring. And so what happens when you look at this, if you look at just the pink surveillance area plus the control, you end up with, across the two catchments, with a bit over 30,000 hectares of area, which works out a bit under $20 a hectare for that work and that protection. But when you look at the full benefit area, as we're defining it, that's closer to 285,000 hectares over those two catchments, or big catchments, and that works out just a bit over $2 a hectare. So we think that shows it's quite a worthwhile investment, this approach. So some of the things we've learned through this work is these are dynamic systems, and it's not just the ecosystems and the weather, but it's also the human systems. So agencies, funding, unplanned events like COVID can all really impact the work that's being done. Having long-term core funding can create a base to build on, is very useful. This large landscape scale approach is very effective, but it makes prioritizing more difficult, especially in a climate of reduced funding. So for example, just sticking to RPMP weeds can be a simpler approach. It's essential to work closely with land occupiers for mutual benefit. Obviously, controlling weeds on one side of the fence, but not the other, is not the most helpful. And finally, the land care groups, they're just core, absolutely positively core for their continued continuity and insights and passions. So what's the outlook? Well, Jobs for Nature funding, the lens portion of it ends after this next season. There's also the Jobs for Funding Nature up in the Rakitata through DOC that ends after the 2024-25 year. So there's potentially at a minimum, there's going to be decreases. This is not set in stone, and this is just kind of a first estimate, but it potentially throws up some interesting dilemmas about, so what do you do in future around this control work, and how do you prioritize? So some potential scenarios are, if you, thinking from a lens perspective that has a lot of sites across the country, one option is you could retain the same sites, and then there's 4 sort of sub options under that. You could cover less area within each of those sites, or you could cover the same area but less comprehensively, so have wider spacing, for example, when you're searching, or you could just target fewer weed species, or you could do it less frequently, say once every 2 years. The other option, major option, is you reduce your sites, say you reduce them in half, and then you can continue with the full coverage of those other sites. So in summary, the multi-agency collaboration has been a successful approach to landscape scale weed management. It's meant that there's been an increase in weed species controlled, and it can be done across land tenure, as we've seen. That can be quite messy in braided rivers, and also address the wider values like the biodiversity. But heading into a climate of reduced funding, of course, it does raise a question of how to prioritize. And that's it. And I don't know that we're doing questions, but I wanted to make sure you could see this nice photo. And also I want to acknowledge, for some of the sharp-eyed, you would have noticed that collaboration picture was not in the Rakitata or Rakaya, was actually up in the Clarence Waiatoa River.